Hello. In the past, it has been very difficult to accumulate political candidate information, but now, with the help of AI, it takes only a few moments. This presentation compares the relevant backgrounds of Darlene Graham and Annie Andrews as regards to their qualifications for a seat in the United States Senate. Please note that neither candidate has a voting record that can be analyzed, and furthermore, this presentation does not consider their views on anything, such as economic or social issues. These factors may be very important to many voters. It does, however, provide a comprehensive analysis of their qualifications for the office. This presentation, if formatted, so that it can either be read or listened to, and by using YouTube, the speed can be adjusted to fit your preference. Well, let's get started. This is as politically neutral an analysis of the South Carolina race for the U.S. Senate as possible using artificial intelligence. I first ask about the qualifications of Darlene Graham, Republican, and then about Annie Andrews, Democrat. I found AI's response to be somewhat lacking, and so I hold its feet to the fire more than once. We do not explore ideologies or how the candidates will likely vote, only experience-based qualifications. I asked ChatGPT, I'm politically neutral with this question. Darlene Graham just won the runoff election to represent the Republican Party in November. Can you list her qualifications to do the job of a U.S. Senator? ChatGPT responded,
Yes. And since the election was only yesterday, I checked current sources rather than relying on what I knew previously. Darlene Graham won the August 25th Republican runoff against Representative Ralph Norman, roughly 52% to 48%, and will face Democrat Annie Andrews in November. She is already serving in the Senate, having been appointed by Governor Henry McMaster after the death of her brother, Lindsey Graham, in July. If we put aside party endorsements, her brother, and campaign positions, and ask the narrower question, what in Darlene Graham's own resume qualifies her to perform the work of a U.S. Senator? Here's what I find. Her substantive qualifications. 1. Nearly 30 years in public service. This is probably the strongest item on her resume. Before entering the Senate, Graham worked for Clemson University, the South Carolina Department of Employment and Workforce, and the South Carolina Department of Vocational Rehabilitation. She joined vocational rehabilitation in 2007 and held several leadership positions there. 2. 7 years running a state agency. Since 2019, she had been commissioner of the South Carolina Commission for the Blind. That's an executive/administrative position rather than merely an advisory one. Her agency provides vocational rehabilitation, independent living, and blindness prevention services statewide. According to her campaign biography, she managed approximately 130 employees in 10 offices and a $90 million budget. The staffing/budget figures come from her campaign, so I'd regard those as campaign supplied rather than independently verified here. That experience is relevant to Senate work, managing budgets, federal-state programs, personnel, regulations, and government bureaucracy. 3. Workforce development experience. She served on the South Carolina State Workforce Development Board and its SC Works Management Committee. She was also president-elect of the National Council of State Agencies for the Blind. That gives her experience working with government programs at both the state and national organizational level. 4. Education relevant to her career. She earned a BS in sociology from the College of Charleston and an MA in rehabilitation counseling from South Carolina State University. She is also a certified public manager. 5. Some private/non-government employment experience. Earlier in life, she worked in an optometrist's office and became a certified optician. She also worked at Clemson and as a rural carrier associate for the Postal Service. It's not preparation for foreign policy, but it does mean her resume isn't exclusively political or governmental. 6. She now has a small amount of actual Senate experience. She was appointed July 13th and sworn in July 14th, so she has only been a senator for about 6 weeks. Nevertheless, she has been voting and functioning as a senator during that period. What's conspicuously not on the resume? This is where the neutral assessment becomes interesting. Before July, Graham had never held elected office. She had no legislative experience, no congressional experience, and apparently no substantial background in foreign policy, national security, defense, taxation, federal budgeting, or constitutional law. Contemporary reporting consistently describes her as a political newcomer, and Graham herself supplied perhaps the strongest evidence of the gap. During the runoff debate, when asked about Taiwan and the South China Sea, she said she was not that informed on national security. That attracted considerable attention because national security and foreign policy are major Senate responsibilities. There's also an unusual political fact worth separating from qualifications. She was appointed to her brother's seat, inherited much of his political infrastructure and staff, was strongly endorsed by President Trump, and benefited from substantial outside spending. Those things help explain how she became a senator and nominee, but they aren't qualifications for doing the job. So, stripped of politics, how strong is the resume? I'd characterize it this way. Graham has a credible resume for senior government administration, but an unusually thin resume for the legislative, national security, and federal policy responsibilities of a U.S. senator. She's not someone with no relevant experience. Running a state agency for 7 years after decades in state government is meaningful executive experience. She presumably knows how bureaucracies work, how government programs are administered, how budgets operate, and how constituent services affect ordinary people. But compared with the conventional resume of a new senator, governor, U.S. representative, state legislator, attorney general, military officer, major executive, etc., her preparation is comparatively narrow. Her strongest qualification is administration and public service, rather than legislating or national policy making.
I again asked ChatGPT, please respond with a similar analysis of Annie Andrews. ChatGPT responded,
Certainly. I'll use essentially the same test I used for Darline Graham. Ignore party affiliation and policy positions as much as possible, and ask what Annie Andrews' background demonstrates about her ability to perform the work of a U.S. Senator. Dr. Annie Andrews is the Democratic nominee who will face Graham in November. She is a pediatrician, medical researcher, and former professor of pediatrics who previously ran for Congress against Nancy Mace in 2022. She has never held elected office. Her substantive qualifications. 1. Roughly 2 decades as a physician. This is clearly the centerpiece of Andrews' resume. She earned her MD from the University of Cincinnati, completed her pediatric residency at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center, and spent about 15 years at the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston. That's relevant to Senate service in a way that goes beyond simply, she's a doctor. Medicine involves making consequential decisions, from imperfect information, evaluating evidence, dealing with people in crisis, and working within large and complicated institutions. It also gives her unusually substantial first-hand experience with one enormous area of federal policy, healthcare. 2. She has significant academic and research credentials. Andrews wasn't solely a practicing pediatrician. She became a professor of pediatrics at MUSC and has conducted clinical research. Her academic work included asthma treatment and prevention and pediatric firearm injuries. An American Academy of Pediatrics biography credits her with more than 30 peer-reviewed publications, primarily involving asthma. She also earned a master's degree in clinical research from MUSC. That is an interesting qualification for legislative work. A senator constantly confronts competing claims about economics, medicine, defense, energy, the environment, etc. Experience evaluating evidence and research is potentially quite transferable, even when the subject matter isn't medicine. 3. She has experience translating professional expertise into public policy. At MUSC, Andrews developed and directed an advocacy curriculum for the Department of Pediatrics. She has served on the Charleston County Medical Society School Health Committee and the Charleston Mayor's Health and Wellness Committee, and has spoken nationally about child health policy and firearm injuries. After leaving regular clinical practice, she founded a political organization concerned with children's issues, including childhood poverty, gun violence, and climate change. Whether one agrees with the policies she advocates is a separate question. As a qualification, though, this demonstrates experience moving from "I encounter this problem professionally" to "what public policy might address it." That's relevant to legislative work. 4. She has already gone through one serious congressional campaign. Andrews was the Democratic nominee for South Carolina's 1st Congressional District in 2022 against Nancy Mace. She lost by about 14 percentage points. Losing an election obviously isn't a qualification in itself, but running a competitive congressional campaign does expose a candidate to federal issues, constituent concerns, media scrutiny, fundraising, debates, and the mechanics of national politics. So, unlike Graham, Andrews has been seriously studying and campaigning on federal issues for several years, even though she hasn't actually governed. 5. She has built and led organizations, but this is a considerably weaker management credential than Graham's. Andrews founded Their Future, Our Vote, and an affiliated PAC following her 2022 campaign. She has also developed programs within academic medicine and built a statewide political campaign that reportedly has more than 2,000 volunteers. That's legitimate organizational experience. But I wouldn't equate it with Graham's experience running the South Carolina Commission for the Blind. Graham has demonstrable experience managing a government agency, employees, offices, and a substantial public budget. Andrews doesn't appear to have comparable large-scale executive management experience. What's conspicuously not on Andrews' resume? As with Graham, this is important. Andrews has never held elected office. Therefore, she has no voting record, no experience writing legislation, no committee experience, and no experience negotiating legislation through a governmental body. She also has no obvious professional background in foreign affairs, national security, defense, international trade, federal taxation, or macroeconomics. Those aren't peripheral Senate responsibilities. They're major parts of the job. Her professional expertise is actually quite deep, but also quite concentrated. Children, medicine, healthcare, public health, and related social policy are areas where she could plausibly enter the Senate knowing considerably more than the typical freshman senator. Put her in a Senate hearing concerning pediatric health, Medicaid, vaccine policy, hospital reimbursement, or medical research, and she'd probably have an unusually short learning curve. Put her in a classified armed services briefing concerning Chinese naval capabilities in the Taiwan Strait, and her professional resume doesn't provide much evidence that she would arrive particularly well prepared. That's not unusual for a new senator. Nobody arrives expert in everything, but it's worth recognizing. So, stripped of politics, how strong is the resume? I'd characterize Andrews this way. She has a strong professional and subject matter resume, but a relatively weak governmental resume. That's somewhat different from Graham. Graham's strongest argument is essentially, I've spent decades inside government and 7 years running a state agency. I understand how government actually works. Andrews' strongest argument is, I've spent 2 decades in a demanding profession, conducted research, worked inside a major healthcare institution, and developed expertise in problems that government policy directly affects. Both have a significant hole in the same place. Neither has meaningful legislative experience, but they have different secondary weaknesses. Graham's resume gives me relatively little evidence of preparation for national policy issues outside the government programs in which she worked. Andrews has demonstrated intellectual and professional depth, but relatively little evidence that she can manage a large governmental organization or navigate an actual legislature. One other difference strikes me as important. Andrews has been deliberately preparing herself for federal elective office longer. She ran for the House in 2022, subsequently created a policy-oriented political organization, and launched this Senate campaign in May 2025, originally intending to challenge Lindsey Graham. Darline Graham's candidacy, by contrast, arose suddenly from her brother's death and her appointment to his seat. That doesn't necessarily make Andrews better qualified, but it does mean that federal politics isn't something she encountered for the first time this summer.
I pushed back with, "We needed to hire a new computer programmer." The person doing the hiring came to me and said, "I've interviewed a number of candidates, and these are the three most qualified. Can I hire one of them?" I asked, "Can any of them do the job?" He thought for a moment and then said, "I don't know." I suggested he might need to look further. ChatGPT responded,
That's a very good distinction between most qualified applicant and qualified to do the job. Your programmer story exposes a weakness in the way political races are commonly discussed. Once the nominees are determined, the question tends to become, which of these two is better? But that's a comparative question. It doesn't answer the prior question. Has either candidate demonstrated that he or she can do this particular job? In your example, ranking the three applicants was almost beside the point. If none could program, being the best of the three didn't solve your problem. The electoral system is different because, as you say, we can't tell the hiring manager to keep advertising the position. In November, voters will choose among the candidates on the ballot or other legally available options, and somebody will occupy the office. There's another complication, though. A U.S. Senator's job is extraordinarily broad. No plausible candidate arrives demonstrably competent in everything a senator encounters: appropriations, agriculture, intelligence, judicial confirmations, monetary policy, nuclear deterrence, healthcare, treaties, and so forth. Senators necessarily rely on staff, committees, experts, and their own capacity to learn. So perhaps the political equivalent of your question isn't, does this person already know how to do every part of the job? It's closer to, what evidence do I have that this person possesses the judgment, knowledge, temperament, work habits, and ability to learn necessary to become competent at the parts of the job he or she hasn't done before? That is a considerably tougher standard than simply comparing resumes, and it suggests that our previous Graham/Andrews exercise may have stopped one question too soon. We identified what each has done. The more revealing analysis would be to define what a U.S. Senator actually has to be able to do. Without reference to either candidate, establish reasonable minimum hiring criteria, and then examine the evidence that Graham and Andrews meet those criteria. That would reproduce your programmer test rather nicely. Write the job description before looking at the applicants.
I said, "We ended up hiring a person with a math major, but had no computer programming experience because computer logic was similar to math logic. They performed quite well." ChatGPT said,
That actually improves the analogy because your standard wasn't, has this person done the job before? It was, is there good evidence this person can do the job? The math major lacked the obvious credential, programming experience, but possessed an underlying capability that transferred mathematical logic. You identified the underlying demands of the position rather than treating previous experience as a proxy for ability. Applied to a senator, that changes how I'd evaluate Graham and Andrews. Lack of legislative experience by itself shouldn't be particularly damning. The better questions are things like, can the person absorb unfamiliar, complicated material quickly? Can they distinguish strong evidence from weak evidence? Can they reason through consequences rather than merely repeat positions? Can they recognize when they don't know something and then learn it? Can they manage and make good use of highly capable staff? Can they negotiate with people they disagree with without surrendering judgment? Can they make consequential decisions under uncertainty? Can they resist pressure from their party, donors, interest groups, and public opinion when their judgment says they're wrong? Do they have sufficient intellectual curiosity to keep learning? Your math major might have scored extremely well on that sort of test, despite scoring 0 for previous programming employment. And that causes me to modify something in my previous assessments. I probably placed too much weight on the candidate's missing legislative experience. That's easily measured, so it's tempting to treat it as especially important. But it's quite possible that someone who has never served in a legislature could make an excellent senator, while someone with 20 years in Congress could be a poor one. The more difficult question is, identifying the Senate equivalent of the mathematical reasoning you saw in that applicant. For Graham, I'd look particularly at her progression through government administration. Did she repeatedly master increasingly complicated responsibilities? Did people entrust her with more responsibility because she demonstrated judgment and competence? If so, that's transferable evidence. For Andrews, I'd look particularly at her progression through medicine and academic research. Did she demonstrate an ability to master complicated subjects, evaluate conflicting evidence, change conclusions when evidence warranted it, communicate difficult ideas, and make decisions where mistakes have consequences? Those abilities are highly transferable. There's also something important in what your hiring decision didn't do. You didn't say, a math major is basically a programmer. You apparently reason, the abilities that made this person successful at mathematics give us reason to believe this person can learn programming. That's a much more defensible inference. And I think you've inadvertently given us a better framework for evaluating these two candidates than the resume comparison I suggested earlier. Rather than scoring Graham and Andrews on experience, I'd be interested in investigating evidence of transferable competence, actual episodes from their careers showing judgment, learning ability, leadership, analytical reasoning, handling mistakes, and dealing with people who disagree with them. That might tell us considerably more about whether either can do the job rather than merely which one has the better-looking resume.
I said, another possibly relevant life experience. There tends sometimes for people outside an organization to be critical of how the organization is being run. That kind of thinking resulted in a highly competent banker being appointed as dean of our college, supposed to right the ship. He had no academic experience beyond his undergraduate degree. The first thing he did was to interview each faculty member to learn what they thought needed changed. The hour I spent with him, in my office, not his, was quite worthwhile. I could see it in his eyes that he had already determined he was over his head. Subsequently, he appointed an internal associate dean, which he relied heavily upon to run the college, and he spent most of his time with outside constituents and on university matters. As a result, he was one of the best deans I served under. Other colleges at other universities who hired non-academics as deans have not fared quite so well. ChatGPT responded,
Yes, very relevant. In fact, I think it adds an important qualification to the lesson of the programmer's story. The programmer's story says, lack of direct experience can be overcome by transferable ability. The dean's story says, transferable ability isn't enough unless the person recognizes what does not transfer. Your banker apparently discovered that distinction remarkably quickly. He may have understood organizations, finance, leadership, and external relationships extremely well. But after talking individually with the faculty, in their own offices, which itself strikes me as significant, he seems to have recognized that an academic institution had an internal culture and operating logic he didn't understand. What he did next may have been the crucial evidence of competence. He didn't pretend that he understood it. Instead, he effectively divided the job. He found someone internally who understood the academic machinery and relied heavily upon that person, while concentrating his own efforts where his abilities apparently did transfer: external constituents, university relationships, presumably fundraising, representation, and broader organizational matters. There's an interesting paradox there. Someone could look at that arrangement and conclude, the associate dean is really running the college, therefore the dean isn't very good. Your experience suggests almost the opposite. Recognizing which decisions should be delegated may have been one of the strongest demonstrations that he was good at the job, and your examples now give us two quite different successful routes into an unfamiliar position. The math major seems to have said, in effect, I don't know programming yet, but I possess the kind of reasoning from which I can learn it. The banker seems to have said, there are important parts of this job I don't understand, and some of them may be better handled by someone who does. Those are different forms of competence: capacity to learn and capacity to recognize one's limitations. The unsuccessful outsider often has precisely the opposite combination. He has been successful somewhere else and concludes that the principles responsible for that success are universal. I've run a bank. Surely I can run a college. He then interprets unfamiliar institutional practices as evidence that the institution is badly managed, rather than considering the possibility that those practices exist for reasons he hasn't yet discovered. That's where your opening observation about outsiders criticizing organizations becomes especially important. An outsider can sometimes see dysfunction that insiders have normalized, but an outsider can also mistake, "I don't understand why they do this," for "there is no good reason they do this." Those are very different conclusions. And that brings us back to evaluating someone for the Senate. I would now add a criterion that might rank surprisingly high. Does the candidate know what he or she doesn't know? Not merely whether the candidate will admit ignorance in an interview or debate. That's relatively easy. I'd want evidence of what happens afterward. Does the person seek out knowledgeable people? Can they distinguish genuine expertise from someone merely telling them what they want to hear? Can they delegate without surrendering responsibility? Can they learn enough to know whether their advisors are giving them good advice? Your dean didn't need to become an academic, but he needed to become knowledgeable enough about academia to recognize who understood it and when to trust that person's judgment. A senator faces that problem every morning. No senator can personally master semiconductor export controls, farm subsidies, nuclear deterrence, Medicare reimbursement, banking regulation, judicial philosophy, artificial intelligence, and the South China Sea. So, perhaps one of the most important qualifications isn't possessing all that knowledge. It's possessing the judgment to know when you don't possess it, where to find it, and what to do with it once you've found it. That also makes me reconsider Darlene Graham's statement that she was not that informed on national security. On its own, admitting ignorance isn't necessarily evidence against competence. Your dean apparently realized very quickly that he was over his head, and that realization contributed to his success. The more revealing question about Graham would be what she did after recognizing the deficiency. And the equivalent question should be asked of Andrews. Her medical and research background demonstrates expertise in one domain, but expertise can sometimes produce the opposite problem: confidence that one's analytical methods transfer more completely to other fields than they actually do. So, I think your two hiring experiences have given us a considerably better job description than simply counting years of experience. For an unfamiliar, complicated position, I would look for demonstrated ability to learn, judgment about what transfers from previous experience, awareness of what doesn't, ability to identify and use expertise, willingness to delegate, and ultimately, the confidence to make the decision personally once the advice is in. Those qualities are much harder to put on a campaign flyer. They may also be much closer to what determines whether somebody turns out to be good at the job.